Masks we wear. Sophie Lawson stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of her modest Portland apartment. The woman looking back at her was almost unrecognizable. Gone were the designer clothes and professionally styled hair. Instead, she wore a simple flannel shirt, jeans with a genuine tear at the knee, and her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "You sure about this, Soph?" Jade Martinez leaned against the doorframe, concern etched across her face. As Sophie's closest friend and confidant, she was the only person who knew what Sophie was doing. "I've never been more certain," Sophie replied, adjusting her glasses, actual prescription lenses, not the designer frames she usually wore. "Every relationship I've had has been contaminated by my family name. I'm tired of being Sophie Lawson, heiress to the Lawson luxury resort empire. So instead you'll be just Soph? Freelance photographer, scraping by, living in this perfectly average apartment that my family's foundation happens to own." Jade sighed. "And volunteering at the Marine Education Center your family secretly funds." "Exactly." Sophie smiled, though anxiety fluttered in her stomach. At 32, she'd grown weary of men who saw her bank account before her heart. 3 months. That's all I'm asking for. 3 months of normalcy. The next morning, Sophie arrived at the Pacific Northwest Marine Education Center, clutching a portfolio of nature photographs. The center was housed in a renovated warehouse by the harbor, all exposed beams and large windows overlooking the water. "You must be Sophie," said a woman with silver-streaked black hair. "I'm Diana, volunteer coordinator." "Welcome aboard." "Thanks for having me," Sophie replied, suddenly nervous. In boardrooms, she commanded attention effortlessly. Here, as just another volunteer, the dynamics felt foreign. Diana led her through the building, explaining the center's mission of conservation education. They rounded a corner to a large tank where a man was adjusting an underwater camera system. "And this is Noah Chen, our marine biologist and education director." Noah turned, and Sophie's rehearsed greeting caught in her throat. He was tall and lean, with thoughtful eyes and an easy smile that transformed his serious expression. His dark hair was slightly damp, as if he'd recently been in the water. "The new photographer?" Noah extended a hand, his grip firm but not imposing. Perfect timing. "We're documenting the new octopus habitat. I'm Soph," she said, catching herself before giving her full name. "Just Soph?" His eyebrow quirked upward. "Sophie," she corrected, flustered. "Sophie Moore." "Well, just Sophie Moore," he replied with a hint of amusement. "Hope you don't mind getting wet." Over the next few hours, Sophie discovered that Noah was as passionate as he was meticulous. He explained each species with reverence, occasionally slipping into technical terminology before catching himself with a self-deprecating laugh. "Sorry, I forget not everyone speaks marine biology as a second language." "I like your enthusiasm," Sophie admitted. In her world, passion was often manufactured for show. Noah's felt authentic. By late afternoon, Sophie's arms ached from holding camera positions, and her clothes were splashed with salt water. Noah handed her a cup of terrible coffee from the break room. "First day survival badge," he said. "You did well." "This coffee, however, did not," Sophie grimaced after a sip. Noah laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Tomorrow, bring your own, trust me." As they sat overlooking the harbor, Sophie felt a strange lightness. For once, someone was seeing her, just her, without the weight of her family name or fortune coloring their perception. "Why photography?" Noah asked suddenly. Sophie hesitated. This was the first real test of her cover story, which was built around a kernel of truth. "It lets me see the world honestly," she finally said. "A camera doesn't care who you are. It just captures what's real." Noah studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and Sophie had the unsettling feeling he was seeing more than she intended to reveal. "I get that," he nodded slowly. "Being seen for who you really are, that's rare." As the sun began to set across the harbor, Sophie realized she'd just taken her first step into uncharted waters. And despite the lies of omission, something about this felt more honest than her real life had in years. Tides of change. 3 weeks into her new life, Sophie found herself anticipating her volunteer shifts with an eagerness that surprised her. The center had become a sanctuary from the pressures of her real identity. She'd developed a routine, arriving early with 2 coffees, one for herself and one for Noah, from the small cafe down the street. "You're a lifesaver," Noah said, accepting the cup with a grateful smile when she found him hunched over tide pool samples. "I was up half the night writing grant proposals." "Anything promising?" she asked, settling beside him. Noah sighed. "We need better equipment for the youth program. These microscopes are ancient." Sophie bit her tongue. She could solve his funding problems with one phone call, but Soph Moore couldn't afford such generosity. "I'm sure something will come through," she offered instead. "Your optimism is cute," Noah said with a wry smile that made her heart flutter. They worked side by side cataloging specimens, Noah occasionally brushing against her as he reached for equipment. Each brief contact sent electricity through her skin. "How'd you end up here?" Sophie asked during their lunch break, perched on the pier with sandwiches. "Marine biology seems like a competitive field." Noah gazed out at the water. "I was headed for a corporate research position after my PhD. Had the job lined up and everything." "What happened?" "My sister got sick, cancer. I came home to help my parents care for her." His voice softened. "After she recovered, I couldn't go back to that path. Life's too short for work without meaning." Sophie felt shame wash over her. Her experiment suddenly seemed childish compared to his genuine life choices. "That's remarkable," she said quietly. Noah shrugged. "Not really. Just human." He turned to her with curious eyes. "What about you? Something tells me there's more to your story than struggling photographer." Sophie tensed. "What makes you say that?" "Your hands," he said simply. "They're not calloused like someone who's struggled their whole life. And sometimes you get this look when people talk about money problems, like you're trying to relate but can't quite manage it." Heat rose to Sophie's cheeks. "I had a different life before. This is new for me." To her surprise, Noah didn't push. "We've all got our before and after moments. The question is, which version feels more like you?" Later that week, Sophie found herself helping Noah build a new interactive display for visiting school groups. Her inexperience with tools became immediately apparent. "Hold it steadier," Noah instructed, trying not to laugh as she wobbled, holding a panel in place. "I'm trying," she protested as the screwdriver slipped again. Noah moved behind her, his chest against her back as he guided her hands. "Like this," he said, his breath warm against her ear. Sophie forgot to breathe. Their bodies fit together perfectly, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. When she turned her head slightly, their faces were inches apart. "I think I've got it now," she whispered, though neither of them moved. "Good," he replied, his voice husky. Diana's voice called from the entrance, breaking the spell. They jumped apart like teenagers caught by parents. That evening, Jade visited Sophie's apartment, eyeing the modest space with amusement. "So how's the experiment going?" Sophie flopped onto her second-hand couch. "It's complicated." "Meaning?" "I think I'm falling for him, Jade. And he likes me. Soph me. Not Sophie Lawson, heiress." Jade's expression grew serious. "That was the point, wasn't it?" "But Soph, the longer this goes on—" "I know," Sophie groaned. "But I've never felt this way before." "He sees me." "He sees part of you," Jade corrected gently. "What happens when he learns the rest?" Sophie had no answer. As she stared out at the Portland skyline, where her family owned 3 luxury hotels she could clearly see from her window, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. "Deep waters. You're sure this is safe?" Sophie asked, eyeing the small boat bobbing in the harbor. Noah grinned, extending his hand to help her aboard. "Scared of a little adventure, photographer?" It was their first real date, a Saturday expedition to photograph tidal caves along the coast. Sophie had agreed immediately, ignoring the growing knot of guilt in her stomach. The boat cut through morning mist as Noah navigated expertly away from the marina. Sophie couldn't help admiring the confidence in his movements, the easy strength in his shoulders as he adjusted the motor. "My father taught me to sail when I was 8, he explained, noticing her gaze. "The ocean's been my second home ever since." They anchored near a secluded cove, the morning sun breaking through clouds to illuminate the rocky coastline. Sophie captured frame after frame while Noah pointed out hidden ecological treasures. "Look there," he said, pointing to a vibrant starfish clinging to rocks. Nature's perfect design. His passion was infectious. Sophie found herself seeing the world through his eyes, not as scenery for luxury resorts, but as a delicate ecosystem worth protecting. "You're good at this," Noah said, examining her camera screen. "These photos tell stories." "That's the highest compliment you could give me," she replied honestly. They ate lunch on a small beach, trading stories. Sophie carefully edited hers, transforming boarding school into public education, family vacations into fictional road trips with friends. Each lie, however small, felt like a pebble in her shoe. When rain began to fall unexpectedly, they sought shelter in one of the tidal caves. The sudden downpour created a shimmering curtain across the cave entrance, enclosing them in a private world. "Looks like we're stuck for a bit," Noah said, spreading his jacket for them to sit on. The close quarters meant their shoulders touched, bodies sharing warmth in the cool cave. "I can think of worse places to be stranded," Sophie replied. Noah turned to her, raindrops glistening in his dark hair. "You know what I've been thinking since you showed up at the center?" "What's that?" she asked, her pulse quickening. "That you're hiding something." His eyes held hers steadily. "And that I don't care." Before she could respond, he leaned forward and kissed her. Sophie's surprise melted into desire as she returned the kiss, her hands finding their way to his face. His lips were gentle but insistent, asking rather than demanding. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie felt dizzy. "Why don't you care?" "Because whatever you're running from or toward, I'm drawn to who you are now, in this moment," he answered, tracing her jawline with his finger. The rain continued, and so did they. Each kiss grew deeper, more urgent. Noah's hands slipped beneath her sweater, warm against the bare skin of her back. Sophie shifted closer, guiding his touch, wanting more of this connection that felt more real than anything in her previous life. They moved together on the sand-strewn cave floor, clothes gradually discarded despite the cool air. Noah's reverent exploration of her body made Sophie feel treasured in a way no expensive gift ever had. When they finally joined, the sound of rain and waves created a perfect soundtrack to their movements. Later, wrapped in Noah's arms as the rain slowed to a drizzle, Sophie felt a completeness she'd never experienced. This intimacy wasn't performed or transactional, it was simply true. "I should tell you something," she whispered against his chest. Noah kissed her forehead. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share." His generosity only increased her guilt. But before Sophie could find the right words, her phone buzzed repeatedly from her discarded jeans. She reluctantly checked it to find multiple urgent messages from Jade. "Emergency. Your parents announced Portland Waterfront Development Project. Press conference tomorrow. Your photo in business journals." Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. Her time was up. "Everything okay?" Noah asked, noticing her expression. "Just work," she lied, perhaps for the last time. "We should head back before the tide changes." As they sailed back to the marina in silence, Sophie watched Noah, the way sunlight caught his profile, how his hands moved confidently on the boat's wheel, and wondered if this beautiful thing they'd found could possibly survive the truth. Storm breaking. Sophie paced her apartment, phone pressed to her ear. "Can't you delay the announcement, Jade? Just a few more days?" "It's already happening," Jade replied. "The Lawson Waterfront Revitalization Project is front-page business news. Your father specifically mentioned your involvement in the environmental conservation elements." Sophie closed her eyes, heart pounding. "And my photo? Corporate headshot from last year's annual report. Anyone who knows you would recognize you instantly." After hanging up, Sophie stood at her window, watching rain streak down the glass. She had perhaps hours before her carefully constructed world collapsed. She could run, disappear back into her real life before Noah discovered her lie. Or she could tell him herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Noah. "Educational committee meeting canceled. Free for dinner tonight?" Decision made, Sophie typed back. "My place? 7 p.m. I need to talk to you about something." She spent the afternoon in anxious preparation, cooking a meal far more sophisticated than sophomore should know how to make. Changing outfits 3 times, rehearsing explanations that sounded hollow even to her. The knock at her door came precisely at 7. Noah stood there with wildflowers and a smile that made her heart ache. "These are from the center's garden," he said. "Diana said we could—" He stopped, noticing her expression. "What's wrong?" Sophie took the flowers with trembling hands. "Come in, please." They sat at her small dining table, the homemade pasta growing cold as Sophie struggled to begin. Noah reached for her hand. "Whatever it is, just tell me." She took a deep breath. "My name isn't Sophie Moore, it's Sophie Lawson, of Lawson Luxury Resorts." Confusion crossed Noah's face, followed by dawning recognition. "The Lawsons? The billionaire family?" "Yes." She couldn't meet his eyes. "I don't understand. Why would you—" The buzzing of Noah's phone interrupted them. He glanced down, then froze. On his screen was a news alert featuring Sophie in elegant business attire, standing beside her father at a podium. The headline read, "Lawson heiress spearheads 300-meter waterfront development." Noah's expression hardened. "Is this some kind of joke?" "I can explain." "Explain what?" He stood abruptly. "That you've been lying since the day we met? That you were slumming it with the common folk for what? Research? Entertainment?" "No!" Sophie reached for him, but he stepped back. "It wasn't like that. I wanted to be seen for me, not my family name." "So you decided deception was the answer?" Noah's voice was quiet but cutting. "The center is receiving a major grant from the Lawson Foundation next week." "Was that your doing?" Sophie flinched. "Yes, but did you know about my grant application?" "Is that why you got close to me?" "Of course not. I fell in love with you, Noah. That part was real." The words hung between them. Noah stared at her as though seeing a stranger. "How would I know what's real with you, Sophie?" He shook his head. "I trusted you with things I don't share with anyone. My sister's illness. My fears about the center's future. Meanwhile, you could have funded our entire operation with your pocket change." "Money doesn't solve everything," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "But honesty might have." He moved toward the door. "I need time to think." "Noah, please." "The irony is," he said, pausing at the threshold, "I wouldn't have cared about your money, but I do care about truth." The door closed behind him, leaving Sophie alone with the consequences of her choices. The next morning brought a media storm. Sophie's undercover experiment had somehow leaked to the press, with speculation about her motives ranging from charitable to calculating. Her phone rang constantly with calls from her parents, board members, and journalists. She ignored them all, instead driving to the Marine Center. The volunteer coordinator met her with an uncomfortable expression. "Is Noah here?" Sophie asked. "He took personal leave," Diana replied. "Sophie, or Ms. Lawson, I suppose. The board is thrilled about the grant. But perhaps it's best if you step back from volunteering for now." Rejected from the one place she'd felt truly herself, Sophie returned to her empty apartment and finally answered a call from Jade. "What do I do?" she asked, voice breaking. "The same thing you've always done," Jade answered gently. "Fight for what matters." True north rain pounded the windshield as Sophie drove along the coast. It had taken 3 days and considerable resources to discover Noah's whereabouts, a remote cabin owned by his family near Cannon Beach. The rational part of her knew this might be considered stalking. The rest of her didn't care. She needed him to understand. The cabin appeared through the trees, smoke curling from its chimney. Sophie parked and sat motionless, courage faltering. Then she noticed Noah's boat tied at a small dock, the same one they'd taken to the tidal caves. The memory gave her strength to step into the rain. She was drenched by the time she reached the porch. Through the window, she could see Noah sitting by a fireplace reading. When she knocked, his head snapped up. He opened the door but blocked the entrance. "How did you find me?" "I'm sorry," she said, water streaming down her face. "I had to see you." Something in her voice, or perhaps her bedraggled appearance, softened his stance. "Come in before you catch pneumonia." Inside, Noah handed her a towel and kept his distance. "Why are you here, Sophie?" "Because I made a mistake. Not in falling in love with you, that's the truest thing in my life, but in how I went about finding it." Noah crossed his arms. You had the Marine Center investigated. The grant money is still coming, no strings attached, she interrupted. I've resigned from the development project. I'm setting up an independent conservation trust for the waterfront instead. He frowned. That doesn't change what happened between us. I know. Sophie took a step toward him. I've spent my life being Sophie Lawson, watching people change when they learn my last name. Men have pursued me for my connections, my influence, my money, never for me. So I tried to separate myself from all that. By lying. By removing the barriers, she corrected. The woman you met at the center, passionate about photography, terrible with tools, who falls asleep during documentaries but tries to hide it, that's the real me. The only false thing was my backstory. Noah turned toward the fire. You still should have trusted me. You're right, but trust isn't easy for me. Sophie moved to stand beside him. The day in the cave, when you said you didn't care what I was hiding, did you mean it? I did, he admitted quietly. But finding out like that in a news alert? I was going to tell you that night. I'd invited you over specifically to tell you everything. She reached for his hand. Noah, I understand if this is unforgivable. But I need you to know that what we shared was real. Every moment, he didn't pull away. When I left, I was angry. But then I started thinking about all our conversations, our time together. The way you looked at tide pools like they were miracles. How you listened to me talk about marine conservation like it mattered. It does matter, she insisted. I know. That's what I realized. Noah finally turned to face her. The money, the name, those aren't you. They're circumstances. And while I wish you'd been honest, I understand why you weren't. Hope flickered in Sophie's chest. So where does that leave us? Complicated, he sighed. I still have questions. Like who you really want to be now that the experiment is over. I want to be who I am with you, she said simply. Whether that's Sophie Moore or Sophie Lawson or just Sophie who brings you decent coffee and takes too many photos of starfish. A small smile tugged at Noah's lips. The coffee was a definite point in your favor. They sat by the fire as evening deepened, rebuilding trust one honest conversation at a time. Sophie shared her childhood isolation, the weight of family expectations. Noah spoke of his fears for the center's future, his reluctance to accept help that felt like charity. I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness, Sophie said as moonlight replaced the rain. Just a chance to start again. Completely honest this time. Noah studied her face. No more secrets? None, she held his gaze. I'm Sophie Lawson, 32, desperately in love with a marine biologist who thinks I take too many photos and can't hold a screwdriver properly. His laugh was soft but genuine. I'm Noah Chen, 34, falling for a woman who's far more than her last name, though it took me some time to see that. When he finally kissed her, it felt like a new beginning. The passion between them hadn't diminished, but something deeper had been added, an understanding that true intimacy required vulnerability. Later, wrapped in blankets on the cabin's small porch, they watched stars appear above the ocean. So what now? Noah asked, his arm around her shoulders. Now, Sophie replied, we figure out who we are together. No masks, no pretending. I like the sound of that, he murmured against her hair. Just us, finding our true north. As the waves rhythmically washed against the shore, Sophie realized she'd finally found what she'd been searching for. Not just love, but belonging. In Noah's eyes, she wasn't an heiress or a photographer or any label at all. She was simply herself, fully seen and accepted. And that, she discovered, was the greatest luxury of all.